Well, good afternoon and a very warm welcome to this, the third and final seminar in our most recent series on the legacy of Bonhoeffer. And as you know, today we're looking at disability theology through the lens of Bonhoeffer. It's a great pleasure to welcome our two speakers, Dr. Eleanor McLaughlin from Ripon College, Cuddesdon, the University of Oxford, will be leading us off. Ellie is the author of the book on unconscious Christianity, which she spoke about at an earlier seminar, and has also written widely on how Bonhoeffer's theology can provide new insights into disability and human flourishing. And our discussants will be Pastor Ruth Wilde, who's tutor in disability inclusion at Northern Baptist College and a former national coordinator of Inclusive Church, which is a network of churches and individuals which campaigns against discrimination in all its forms within the church. Before we start, the usual few bits of housekeeping. We anticipate that there will be plenty of time for a Q&A session. If you think of points you would like to make or questions you'd like to answer during the course of the talks, please feel free to either indicate that you'd like to ask a question or make a point in the chat, or put a question itself in the chat if you'd like me to read it out at the appropriate time. We are going to record this seminar with the agreement of our two lead speakers. So if anybody particularly doesn't want to be recorded, it's probably best to put your question in the chat and let me ask it for you. There's also a very exciting piece of news at the very end of the session about a forthcoming event, but that's for the end. So without more ado, it's a great pleasure to welcome again Ellie to lead us off on disability theology through the eyes of Bonhoeffer. Ellie.
Great, thank you very much, Alan. It's a pleasure to be here with you, as it always is. So I have some slides that I'm going to use as a kind of background to what I'm saying this afternoon. So I hope people can see that. What we're going to do is we are going to look first of all at what disability theology is, pick up some main themes that emerge from it, look at one of the key thinkers in this area, and then we're going to move into a discussion about some of what Bonhoeffer says in his work, particularly on what it means to be human in his work Creation and Fall, where he's writing on Genesis 1 to 3, those early creation narratives. And then we're going to try to kind of put those things together and see where that gets us. So to begin, what is disability theology? What do we mean when we use this term? So very kind of generally speaking, it's theology by, for, and including people with disabilities. Theology that seeks to liberate people both with and without disabilities from oppressive structures which are caused by ableism. And it's a theology that takes experiences of disability seriously as a starting point for theological investigation and theological reflection. So when we say theology by, for, and including people with disabilities, and this experience of disability really being a starting point, it's important to underline that thinkers in this area sometimes have disabilities themselves, sometimes are carers or family members of people with disabilities, and often, very often, their writing and their thinking in this area stems from a personal experience of disability, whether that's physical disability or intellectual disability. There's a whole wide range within this field of different focuses to explore, and also a different range of types of writers, right? People who are writing from their own experience of disability, or if you want to think of it as a kind of once removed, people who are not themselves disabled but are trying to articulate a theology of disability based on what they see their family member or the person for whom they care, based on their experience of caring for that person. So a really helpful place to start where we're thinking about disability theology is to notice that not everyone thinks about disability in the same way. And societally, we've kind of come up with, we'll see there are more models than just the two presented here, but generally speaking, disability is often presented in society in one of two ways. Now, the first model of disability that is really common is this biomedical model or medical model of disability. And what this model says is that disability is the problem and it needs to be fixed. And here we can see that there's quite an identification of disability with illness, right? That happens a lot in the medical model of disability. So if we take that a bit further, the person with the disability is considered individually rather than as part of a group of people with disabilities. And the person with disability says, say smart and smart, understands that he or she belongs to a devalued group, which is quite harsh language, but they're trying to underline the idea that within the medical model of disability, there's, if you like, an imagined bar of normality, to use a very problematic word, but this medical model presents a kind of a bar of attainment. And if the person with the disability doesn't meet that bar in one way or another, then the medical model is going to say, okay, well, let's fix this. Let's make it so that we try to get you to reach this bar of normalcy. And the implication there is that you are devalued if you cannot reach that bar. So a really different way of thinking about disability, a really different model, is the socio-political model or the minority model. They're called these two different names. Here, the prejudice and discrimination that people with disabilities face are the problem which needs to be fixed. So we're moving from a focus on the disabled person to a focus on the context. In this model, people with disabilities view themselves as a minority group which is oppressed by the majority or by the systems that have arisen to suit the majority. In this model, people with disabilities do not view themselves as belonging to an inferior or devalued group. So those are two main ways that we see in scholarship and in society of viewing disability. There are, in fact, many more, which it's just helpful to kind of have in our minds as we think through questions of disability. So there's this moral and or religious model. Here I'm following Mano Retief and Rantoa Latsosa in their article Models of Disability, a brief overview, and it's a theological text, so they're focusing, of course, on theological and religious models. Here, you might want to think of this as the traditional religious view because it's changing, but you might want to think of this as the traditional religious view where disability is seen as an act of God. The disabled person is the recipient, if you like, of an act of God. They'll go on to talk about all these different models and you know the problems and any positive factors associated with each model, but for the moment, these are just descriptors. The medical model, as we've just seen, where disability is portrayed as a disease, and the social model, where disability is seen as a socially constructed phenomenon. Then moving on, we get the identity model. Now here, disability is portrayed as an identity, and generally speaking, a positive identity. This is a much more recent movement within disability thinking. The human rights model, where disability is a human rights issue, first and foremost, and the cultural model, where disability is seen as a specific culture. And here, when we think about disability through the culture model, we consider a range of cultural factors in specific cultures that impact on disability and shape disability. Now, the next one may seem familiar to people living in Britain, because this is often put forward in government rhetoric, the economic model where disability is seen as a challenge to productivity. And so ideally, we would all be being productive members of society, but disability is seen as something that holds people back from being able to do that. And you can imagine all the kind of value-laden consequences that come along in the wake of this model of disability as a challenge to productivity. Then there's the charity model, where disability is perceived as victimhood. And you might remember things like the telethon, which really buys in to the charity model, where disability is portrayed as victimhood. And then lastly, this is drawing on some new scholarship, relatively new scholarship within the past 15 years, Deborah Creamer, who writes about disability as an embodied experience, and she uses the limits model to talk about disability. Her work really draws on the idea that to be human is to have limits, and that is a common factor to all of us existing as human beings. And she then focuses in on disabled people to think about disability in terms of limits. And we can talk more about that later on as well, if people want to investigate those ideas further. So hopefully this gives us a bit of an idea. The point here isn't to investigate all of these models, but to give you an idea that disability isn't ever, it's always a multifaceted thing. And when we talk about disability, it's quite likely that if there are several people gathered together talking about disability, we're all layering in at least a few of these different models, or we're all aware at least of a few of these different models, even if we don't know the names of them. And they all shape and color how we think about disability. So I want to spend some time thinking about Nancy Eastland, who's really one of the foundational thinkers, if not the foundational thinker, when it comes to disability theology. She's importantly both a sociologist of religion and a disability studies scholar. And so she combines those two facets of her scholarship together in her work. Her interest in disability and a lot of her writing around disability comes from the fact that she is herself disabled, born with a congenital bone defect, which caused her to have numerous operations and joint replacements. She talks very candidly about this in her own work and talks about her experience as a young child being taken to various different healers by her parents, and her struggle with the fact that she never was healed, and that um, how that was reflected back to her by the various Christian communities of which she was a part. So she's very open about her own experience of disability. And as I said, she contributed to two distinct fields of scholarship: disability studies and sociology of religion. Her book, The Disabled God Toward a Liberatory Theology of Disability, was simply an honours thesis at its inception, but when it was published in 1994, it quickly became a classic, and it's referred to a lot. And there was a recent book by Lisa Powell, which is called The Disabled God Revisited. So it's really still a very, very influential text in the field. So Nancy Eastland has a central idea which it's worth bearing in mind when we think about disability theology. She talks about the biblical scene of the resurrection, and says that in the resurrected Christ, we see a perfect Christ. And this perfect resurrected Christ bears wounds in his hands and his feet and his side. So this perfect, disabled, resurrected Christ allows us to see bodily perfection in a new way. Bodily perfection as including wounds, scars. And this image allows us to understand bodily perfection as including disability. And she's referring to the fact that previously, in the grand sweep of Christian tradition, disability is almost always portrayed as defective in some way, certainly as not perfect. But here she's making a claim about perfect divinity and bodily perfection, which includes disability. That's really her strong contribution to disability theology. And because of that, sorry, before we move on to this, there's one more thing to say. So she then moves from there to the title of her book, which is, as you can see, The Disabled God. So she's making a claim here that the fact that we see scarring, wounds in the risen Christ leads us to be able to say that God, in God's perfection, is a disabled God. And that's really her central argument. And that leads her to make further claims about God in relationship to humanity. So she's then going to go on and say that God is not independent or autonomous, but interdependent. And on page 103 of her book, she's going to say the disabled God is a God for whom interdependence is not a possibility to be willed from a position of power, but a necessary condition of life. And that's a very strong claim. So some people, some theologians would say, yes, of course, God can choose to become interdependent with humans. God starts off in a position of independence, of autonomy, but through God's love, God chooses to become interdependent, to become engaged, to become enmeshed with humans. But she's saying, no, there's no choice, there's no willing that God does to then become interdependent, but rather this interdependence is a necessary condition of the divine life. Now, people debate this point endlessly, but that's her contribution to the field, and it's very it's provocative, and it's ongoingly provocative. So if we can come back to Eastland, but let's park her for a moment there. But we can see that her influence on disability theology is ongoing, and disability theology tends to highlight two related things. First of all, God's interdependence with creation. In a lot of disability theology, we get this emphasis on God's interdependence with creation. And as a ramification of that, humans' interdependence with each other and with God. So there's a lot of chat in disability theology about humans being interdependent rather than autonomous from each other, and also human interdependence with God. And I hope that through my choice of random decoration of my slides here, of all the little points connected by these little lines, I'm trying to present a kind of visualization of this idea of interdependence, which is really central in a lot of disability theology. So we've kind of seen a little bit what it means to be human from Eastland's perspective, a strong focus on interdependence. And it's worthwhile saying that this view, although it is very much part of the trends within disability theology, it's also outside of disability theology as well. So we get people like Rowan Williams in his little book, Being Human, Minds, Bodies, Persons, talking about ways in which people interact and ways in which we kind of are human in human culture that says something very similar to what Eastland is saying. So in this passage, Williams is presenting two different views of the self, one of which he's going to reject and one of which he's going to promote. So first of all, he talks about an individual view of the self. This is the one that he wants to reject. But we could think of ourselves as being as saying, I am at the center of the world, one unique example of the group human beings. I put myself at the center. I am unique, and I then kind of look at other people, but basically I'm at the center, and I'm kind of the most important thing happening, or at least the first reference point. Williams isn't very keen on that way of thinking about what it means to be human. He much prefers what he calls the personal view of the self, which goes like this. I am someone who interacts and engages with others, a point at which relationships intersect, where a difference may be made, and new relations created. So according to this personal view of the self, I know that my own point of view is always partial, and I recognize that I am, quote, a node point in a web of exchange, which corporately constructs the idea of object, selves, persons. So in thinking about what does it mean to be human, if you're kind of following this trend, you're going to want to see our each person's embeddedness in relational kind of transactions, to put it in a slightly economic way. We're constantly in relation with each other. There's constant flux between people, this web of exchange that Williams talks about. Um, and we can't kind of abstract ourselves from that and say, oh no, I'm not part of this web of exchange. I'm autonomous. Here I am, apart from everything, all the other people that are over there. So there, it's worth knowing that disability theology, some of its central ideas have kind of leaked out into. I don't think Williams would say he was doing disability theology here, but thinking about what it means to be human, disability theology ideas have percolated into that wider discussion. Here we come to Hans Reinders, who's a really interesting writer in the field of disability theology, and he wants to highlight this idea of, maybe we could call it the web, like Williams calls it a web. And he wants to say that even when people are not able to themselves be conscious of the fact that they are human beings in this web of exchange, we as others who are conscious of that fact can kind of do it on their behalf. Reinders is writing out of a concern here that arose because of philosophical developments in the late part of the 20th century, where we get thinkers like Peter Singer and Michael Tooley who want to suggest that in order to be a real person, you need to be able to fulfill certain capacities. You need to be able to have certain capacities, such as being aware of yourself, having a sense of yourself as a person in the past and in the present and in the future. And Hans Reinders is saying, yeah, but what about people who can't do that? What about people with severe developmental disabilities who aren't able to project themselves into a future because they're not really conscious of themselves as individuals in the present anyway, and surely they are still persons. We mustn't write them off. So his concern is to counter that philosophical trend. And here's a piece of his text. He often writes about this young woman, Kelly, who has severe developmental disabilities. And he describes her in a passage before this one and says that as far as we others can tell, Kelly doesn't really know when people come in or leave her room. She doesn't really know if people are talking to her or not. She doesn't show any response. But for Reinders, that doesn't detract anything from her dignity as a human person. It doesn't take away from her personhood. And here's what he says. Human dignity does not have individual action as its originating source. Kelly's dignity does not depend on what she is or is not capable of doing. It is a dignity she possesses as a human being, a human person with a relational identity. It is a dignity that is communicated to her in the acts of people caring about her and about her well-being. If the chaotic force of her natural condition would have had its way, Kelly would have been dead years ago. Her dignity is that she has been accepted as God's creature, which is what she shares with all of us. So in that last sentence, you can see that for Reinders, that which underlies human dignity or supports human dignity is our creatureliness, the fact that we are creatures of God. And he's going to go on to say that, in fact, the relationship that really provides each of us with our value as human creatures is the Trinitarian relationship. And that Trinitarian relationship that we are then caught up in is what gives us our dignity as human beings. But people like Michael Mawson, and here we're going to segue into some Bonhoeffer stuff. People like Michael Mawson are going to say, well, that's all very well, and it works on a theoretical level. But if we say, oh, it's fine because it's the Trinitarian God that is upholding that person's dignity, that rather lets us as a society off the hook. We don't really need to do anything to uphold that person's dignity because God's doing that anyway, so we're kind of fine. So his concern is that theologically basing a relational anthropology on triune persons and relations, and our own ecstatic transformation towards the communio of the Trinity, threatens to undermine or obfuscate the necessarily bodily and concrete nature of our human relationality. And if such an anthropology provides a basis for an ethics of friendship, then it is similarly left unclear how this is an ethic that is necessarily attentive to what is concretely entailed in our friendships. He hasn't really done us any favors with two really long and complicated sentences there, but basically what he's saying is we need to think about our relationality as human beings, both disabled and non-disabled, in a really concrete way. And we mustn't simply just say people who can't consciously see themselves in this web of relationality, they're just upheld by God. We have to do some of that heavy lifting ourselves. He's drawing on Bonhoeffer here. And so here's where we get to grips with some looking at disability through the lens of Bonhoeffer. We have this excerpt from a sermon that Bonhoeffer gave in 1934 when he was living in London. And he is talking about an experience that he had when he was living in Bethel, where he worshipped alongside a group of people with disability who lived in a home nearby. And he says that he's interested in how the non-disabled population related to the disabled population. And he says this, in the attitude of benevolence and beneficence, the seriousness of the problem is not at all recognized. Weakness to them, the people without disabilities, is nothing but imperfection. But this includes, of course, that the higher value in itself is strength and power. Strength and weakness are considered in the proportion of the perfect and the imperfect. Here, Christianity must protest. With all due respect for the real sacrifices that have been made in such a benevolent attitude, it must be said frankly that this approach is wholly wrong and unchristian, for it means condescension instead of humility. So here Bonhoeffer is really taking a swing at this idea that physical strength is related to perfection and physical weakness is related to imperfection. And he's saying that this attitude of the non-disabled being condescending towards the disabled is wholly wrong and unchristian. So we get a sense here of Bonhoeffer's kind of grappling with the experience of worshipping alongside disabled people and of observing the relationships between the two populations. And it's perhaps, I would want to say, notable that this is very shortly after he has been writing about the creation narratives in Genesis 1 to 3. And one of the things that he talks about here is the tree of life in the center of the garden and Adam's existence in that context. And he says this: the life that comes from God is at the center. That is to say, God who gives life is at the center. At the center of the world that has been put at Adam's disposal and over which Adam has been given dominion is not Adam himself, but the tree of divine life. Adam's life comes from the center, which is not Adam, but God. It revolves around this center constantly without ever trying to take possession of this center of existence. Adam is not in temptation to touch the tree of life, to seize hold of the divine tree at the center. So here he's also talking about strength and weakness and limitation. And he's saying one might imagine that in the creation narrative, Adam gets to be at the center of the garden and gets to be the strong one. But God doesn't set it up in that way. And God puts the tree of life at the center of the garden, and God retains the space at the center. And Adam doesn't have to take up the center. He can just rely on God being at the center of his existence. So I hope that this is starting to make sense. We'll see where he goes next. But the main idea here is that God is at the center of creation for Bonhoeffer. This is what he's trying to say. And that Adam doesn't take hold of the center of his own existence. He's very much reliant on God to be that center. And that implies that there is a prohibition as well. Adam is not, God tells him to not try to take the fruit from the tree. God is very clear to say that Adam is not to touch the tree of life. He has to just rely on God to be at the center of his own existence. And maybe this kind of idea becomes a bit more accessible when we think about Bonhoeffer develops this idea in his text that God's prohibition not to touch the tree is both a limit that he sets on Adam, you're not to do this, but also a grace. Because Bonhoeffer is going to say, what a great thing for Adam that he doesn't have to be at the center of existence and like do all the he says Adam doesn't have to live out of his own resources. He can live out of God's resources because God is at the center of his life. So it's a limit and also a gift of grace that Adam gets to rely on God, who is at the center. And that's a really important concept for Bonhoeffer. And he'll go on to say, this is a rather lengthy quote, but I think it's worth sticking with it because he also talks about how we are, as human beings in relationship with each other, enacting both that limit and that grace to each other. So let's go with the quote and then see what we think about it. So he says, knowing the other person, he's talking about Adam and Eve here, knowing the other person as God's creature, simply as the other who stands beside me and constitutes a limit for me. And at the same time, knowing that the other person is derived from me, from my life. And so loving the other and being loved by the other, because the other is a piece of me, all that is for Adam the bodily representation of the limit that should make Adam's limit easier for Adam to bear. In other words, I always love it when Bonhoeffer goes, in other words, because he knows he's being really unclear and then he tries again. In other words, love for a person helps one to bear the limit. The other person is the limit that God sets for me, the other limit that I love and that I will not transgress because of my love. This means nothing other than that both people, while remaining two creatures of God, belong to one another in love. By the creation of the other person, freedom and creatureliness are bound together in love. That is why the other person is once again grace to the first person, just as the prohibition against eating from the tree of knowledge was grace. So to unpick that, we can think of this in very, very practical terms. So you're sitting in the living room with your friend has sat down on your favorite armchair. You cannot now sit down on that favorite armchair because your friend is in it. It's kind of annoying. That's your favorite armchair, but your friend has sat in it, and so you can't do that, right? So your friend has constituted a limit for you there. You are limited in your choice of seating in your own living room. However, you also love your friend. And so your limit that your friend has represented to you is made easier for you to bear because you love your friend. And that's, in a way, what Bonhoeffer is saying here. When Adam and Eve see that they are in relation to each other and that they limit each other, because they also love each other, that limit is made easier to bear. And he's going to say, the limit that we represent to each other reminds us that we do not have to live out of the center of our own existence. We can live out of the center which God inhabits. So he says at the end, that is why the other person is once again grace to the first person, just as the prohibition was grace. So it's something to mull over, but I think that this becomes really important when we're thinking about disability theology, because often when we're thinking about human relationality, we're tempted into thinking mainly in terms of autonomy and self-reliance and being able to do everything for oneself. And we are hesitant to, society as a whole is hesitant to give value to some disabled persons because they are seen as not autonomous, not being able to do things for themselves in the way that society might expect, and therefore they're devalued. But this way, particularly Bonhoeffer's way of thinking about human relationality and the limits that we present to each other, I think helps us think about disability in a theological way. So to conclude, a few thoughts. Disability theology, as we saw towards the beginning, allows us to think of God as disabled, needing others, and not being autonomous. Disability theology highlights interdependence and relationality. Bonhoeffer calls us to pay attention to real people, not to our imagined versions of who people are. And that's, again, really important when we really encounter the other person. When Adam and Eve encounter each other, they are paying attention to who the other person really is, rather than Adam going, oh, I expect Eve to be like this, and so I'm just going to imagine that she's like that. I'm not going to pay attention to what she says about herself, and vice versa. For Bonhoeffer, real relationality is paying attention to the real people that we encounter and not trying to make them fit some kind of imagined version of who they are. And he sees our relationality and interdependence as symbolizing both God-given limits and divine grace. So I am going to finish there. I've put some books on this last slide. Some of them are rather blurry, unfortunately, but hopefully you'll be able to at least get an idea of some of the books that I've referenced, or that I haven't referenced but would have if I'd have more time. So yes, thank you very much for listening. I hope that I've provided a bit of food for thought, and that then together with Ruth's contribution, we'll then be able to have some good discussion.
Thank you very much, Ellie. That was absolutely superb. Thank you. It was making complicated ideas clear and simple is a real skill, and thank you very much indeed. Just before I introduce Ruth, could I just, in 1 second, there was a question in the chat about, is this available later? And the answer is yes, this is being recorded, and the recording of Ellie's talk, Ruth's response, and the discussion will be on the Project Bonhoeffer website very shortly. So that's the answer to that question. But thanks again, Ellie, thank you so much. And if we can now move straight to Ruth's response and then go to the question and answer. So a very warm welcome, Ruth, and it's good to see you again.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. It's good to see you. Good to be with you. Thank you, Ellie, for that brilliant talk. So I did have some notes of Ellie's talk beforehand, and I wanted to draw out a couple of things from what she's brought from Bonhoeffer specifically. So the two things that I really want to expand on a little bit are the two insights from Bonhoeffer, which relate to disability for me, that really stuck out. Are number one, the dichotomy of strength and weakness and perfection and imperfection. And the second one is the idea of limits and grace, which I think is a really interesting, quite complicated idea. Like Alan said, it is quite hard to get your head around all of that. So in terms of the first one, well, first of all, both of them, I think it's interesting to notice, both of them other people, but one in a kind of positive way and one in a kind of negative way. So you've got the idea of limits and grace, which is othering people in a respectful way, a limit between you and other people, but also that relationality, that love. And then you've got the idea of this kind of difference between strength and weakness, perfection, imperfection, and the values put on those things, which makes some people less valuable than others. So it's othering in a really negative, horrible way. Because you've got strength equals good, weakness equals bad, perfection, whatever that is, equals good, imperfection equals bad. And Bonhoeffer says quite strongly, and I would agree with him, that this is actually unchristian, this idea of perfection and strength as being good. He says it's unchristian because it's condescension, not humility. Yes. So I think there's two other really, really important reasons why it's unchristian. Number one, it's totally opposite to our Christian central story. So it's unchristian because Jesus shows us the opposite, that strength is in weakness and vulnerability, that God in Jesus is not a vision of what might be considered strong or perfect insofar as, you know, how we might see it. Although I did note that Nancy Iceland used the word perfect in a completely subversive way, which I thought was interesting, about Jesus as disabled God being a perfect, and then therefore the disability being included in that perfection. So that was an interesting kind of subversion of that idea. But if we go with the idea that perfect is kind of this kind of not having illness, not, you know, being strong, not being disabled, etc., then it is very unchristian. And we see that in the story of Jesus. We see it in what Paul draws out of the story of Jesus, and out of his own story of being kind of perfected and closer to God because of his own vulnerabilities and possible disability. Some people would have it. And even as Eastland points out, even after the resurrection, those kind of disability, the wounds are not, they're not gone. So, which is an interesting one for anyone that might be interested in talking about afterlife or that kind of thing, you know, and people not being kind of made perfect, as it were, in that idea of an afterlife. And I think it's also unchristian for another reason. And that is that there are so many places in the Bible where it says, do not fear. And this idea of fear of disability, fear of weakness, is very against the Christian gospel. Fear of anything is against the Christian gospel, but fear of vulnerability, fear of aging, fear of weakness, fear of disability, this all links to a fear of death. In the end, that's where we go with it. And fear of death really can't be Christian, because we don't have a line between life and death in God. God's life goes beyond death, and we, therefore, entering into God's life, go beyond death. So this is a very unchristian thing, to be afraid of something that in the end is about a fear of death. So these are the reasons, I think, as well as what Bonhoeffer said, those are the reasons as well that it's very much unchristian. And we shouldn't be basing a kind of Christian ethic or theology on a fear of death or a fear of disability or anything like that. And disability used to be, and still is in some places in some churches, linked to this idea of sin, of it being because of your sin or somebody's sin in your past and your ancestry. But I would say that the real sin is this sin of our idea of perfection, and thinking that that is A, something that exists, B, that something that's attainable, and C, something that's desirable, to have this kind of perfect person that's never ill and doesn't have any disability, etc., and is perfectly strong and independent and autonomous. And I think Jesus shows it up as perverse. And Jesus knows that if we're going to talk about perfection, it's a very kind of difficult concept anyway. But I think that the only thing you can really talk about, you can't talk about bodily perfection really, because we'll get into this a bit more, but there is no kind of idea of bodily perfection. There is no one that is, doesn't have any kind of illness or is short-sighted, or you know what I mean. There's always, we all have something. There's no bodily perfection, but perfection perhaps you could say it could be found in love and in grace, and that's what Bonhoeffer points us towards, I think. So love and grace are, of course, to do with relationship, which leads us to that second one, which is to do with the limits that we all have, and not just disabled people, but all of us. We all get ill. We all, if we're fortunate enough to live long, probably become disabled in some way. We all die. We all lose capacities at some point. And in some ways, it's a privilege to get to that point, because like us, one lives to start to have to adjust to having less capacity. Not everyone lives that long. And not accepting the fact that we are all kind of not necessarily, there's something that people in disability theology and the disabled community call temporarily able-bodied. I'm sure you've come across this, Ellie, which is the idea that actually there's not really a dichotomy between disabled and able-bodied, apart from the kind of political way, social construct type of way, because actually all of us are likely to become disabled at some point. We're temporarily able-bodied. And so there's that idea in disabled thought and theology, and not accepting this as a fact is actually what leads us to sin against ourselves and others, and it leads to pain and it leads to isolation, because we think that we are independent when we're not. And it not only makes us, as Bonhoeffer said, condescending towards disabled people, but also arrogant towards God, because the whole thing is that it's a freedom, like Bonhoeffer says, it's a freedom and a grace to not have to be the center, to not have to control everything, to recognize that we can't control everything and that we have to let go and trust God. And if we don't, then we have this arrogance towards God that we think we are like God, or that we can be kind of controlling everything. And so that's also a kind of related, interesting thought from Bonhoeffer there. And I think it's a very harmful trap and a very harmful lie, this idea of independence, really. As we're none of us fully independent at all. And it's actually like I said, it's like a freedom to recognize that and to not have to try to pretend that we are, and to know that we're actually reliant on one another. And this is a really interesting quote that I found. I think it was in something probably from Richard Rohr that comes in my inbox. Anyway, I picked it up because I thought it was really, really good. And it's from Gerald May, and he says, in growing psychologically, one moves towards increasing autonomy and independence. In growing spiritually, one increasingly realizes how utterly dependent one is on God and on the grace of God that comes through other people. So I thought that was a very beautiful way to put it, because you can only go so far in terms of growth to think I need to be more independent and more kind of, but actually that can be part of growth in terms of, especially maybe if you're kind of somebody that leans towards codependency, which is unhealthy. To learn to be more independent can be good, but in the end, it only takes you so far, because actually we realize that we are fully reliant on God and others. And so it is a freedom to accept that. And we learn to depend on God, and we learn to be dependent, as Ellie said, which is what leads us actually to true love between one another, because you get only isolation if you go down the road of thinking you're fully independent and you don't need anyone. That's where you end up, is that you don't have loving relationship, because loving relationship comes from recognizing the need for one another, actually, and admitting that need, whether you're disabled or not. And the other side to that is that the disabled are not only their disability, that we all have needs and gifts. So you've got this thing where you've got to balance out. You've kind of got to pull down the people that think they're very independent and able-bodied, and push up the disabled people, I think, in terms of you've got to take so this idea that disabled people are all very dependent and all of this and not autonomous. We need to be thinking, actually, a lot of disabled people are more independent, and it might be some of our social the way that society is constructed that is making them more dependent. So they're more independent, often more autonomous than we think, and we are less independent and autonomous than we like to think when we're not disabled. And I say we because I'm not physically disabled. I have a neurodivergent condition, but whether you want to include that in disability or not is up to you, really. So I think you've got to do both, really, to have a healthier view of disability. And so I think that is where we'll heal from this, the lie and the toxicity of this kind of lie of independence is where we realize more that we're all interdependent, that the able-bodied are also in need of others and more vulnerable. Disabled people are more independent and less vulnerable, and we all have gifts and needs, all of us. So, to summarize then from kind of Bonhoeffer's ideas, I'd say that the first one is strength is not good and weakness bad. Perfection exists perhaps only in love and grace, but certainly not in bodily kind of ideas that we might have. And our limits and needs of others are what leads us to relationship, which leads us to love and grace. I think it's incredible, but Bonhoeffer seems to have really understood disability theology well before his time, doesn't he? So we'll end with that thought.
Thank you very much indeed, Ruth. I've got something I'd love to jump in, but Ellie, would you like to reply first? Just a few comments in response to Ruth, and then we'll move to discussion.
No, I mean, thank you so much. I was taking notes as you were talking. Yeah, I mean, I think Alan, go for it. If you have something you want to jump in, and we can converse as we go.
There's a message from Karen on the chat. It's just as if I have to go. Any chance that you have your notes, Ruth, to pass on to us, please? Thank you, and Ellie, for a really enjoyable discussion.
I have notes, but they're all scrawled in pen, so that's the trouble. They're not typed up.
Okay. As I say, this is the same person who asked earlier about it. Would it be available afterwards? And the seminar will be recorded. Now, I mean, there's an extraordinary experience. Listening to Ellie, I was sort of transported back about 2 decades, because like yonks ago, when I was a social policy academic and I was writing about different perspectives on welfare, I spent a lot of time working on the feminist ethic of care in philosophy. And that started extraordinary parallel, because the great book is by a woman called Eva Feder-Kitte called Labour's Lost. And that starts as a critique of liberal philosophy, John Rawls and all that, which has the autonomous actor. Well, hang on, there are a lot of actors who aren't autonomous. How on earth does all of this vast edifice of political liberal theory apply to people who do not all have the same cognitive capacities and so on. And she expanded that into an absolutely wonderful critique of welfare as well. And she used to write about what's called the doula, D-O-U-L-I-A, which is the person who supports the mother of the newborn child and then meets her needs so she can meet the need of the child. And she constructed a case for welfare as providing that kind of support to enable people to participate in what's customary within the wider society. And I just thought there was just a sort of fascinating parallel between the discussions about perfection and Christian theology and that. It was just, I mean, I was sitting there frantically trying to take my head back 20 years ago to remembering it properly. But thank you very much for that. Can I throw it open to any other questions, discussions? Is there anybody who wants to put their hand up or indicate anything in the chat? This is the most uncharacteristic silence.
Can I respond briefly to something that Ruth said, just with an anecdotal, well, actually two things. I think that you mentioned the fact that in some churches disability is still linked with sin. Obviously that's as you know, that's one of the main gripes that Eastland has against the church, that she says, you know, this has just been so harmful for the disability community at large that this message is just perpetuated endlessly. And I think it's, although there are some churches in which that's really no longer the case and they're trying hard to change the narrative, it's worth noting that it's still not universally the case. So one of the books that I put up on that last screen is Amy Kenny's My Body Is Not a Prayer Request. That's a great book for anyone interested in thinking about this further. And the book came out quite recently, so she's been interviewed on multiple podcasts that are available online, so you can hear her talking about her book, even if you don't want to read it. And one of the things that she says, she uses a mobility scooter a lot of the time, sometimes a wheelchair, I think. But she has people coming up to her and offering to pray for her, or just kind of going ahead and praying for her anyway. And it's always for physical healing. It's never for anything else. And, you know, understandably, she says, I wish someone would just ask me what I would like prayer for, because it's not as if I don't want prayer. And actually, prayer for healing would be great, but prayer for healing of my relationship with my siblings, perhaps, or prayer for healing for, you know, a fracture that's happened in my workplace and everyone's really sad about it. And, you know, so she kind of gives some other examples of prayer for healing that she'd really appreciate, but people just don't bother to ask her. And I think that is so key to the relationality thing that we've both been talking about, that how can you have a meaningful relationship with anyone if you don't bother to ask them what's going on in their life, right? And you just go with your assumptions about what would be helpful and what would be not helpful. Yeah, so that your talk made me think of both of those things. And there's also a wonderful sign in Victoria Turner's edited volume Young, Woke and Christian. There's an article by Chrissy Thwaites on disability in that, where she has a picture of a disability parking sign in the car park of a church. And there's the little disability sign, and then underneath it says soon to be healed. And what we make of that is interesting.
Yeah. And I think some of this is that we have to really tackle head on the healing narratives in the Bible. Because I think the fact that we see healing disabled people doesn't help the narrative. And so we've got to change the narrative. And probably in a similar way to the way that we have around LGBT kind of texts, you know, that have been used against LGBT people. And then once you've got and debunked and helpfully kind of unloaded that, then you can move on to seeing the really positive things in scripture, which point to a better way to understand theology. So I think the same is true of disability, because people will always be like, yes, but Jesus, you know. And actually what's interesting, some of the things that I've read that so far I've found helpful about those healing narratives is number one, is that often it's because of the way the society was in terms of relationship, and being excluded from your community entirely if you were disabled. So there's a very, very different society going on there. And so there's something to do with healing that was actually in order for someone to be accepted back into their community. So there's that maybe as well, which could be a helpful way to view it. But there's also some interesting things that you can draw out of some of the narratives. There's one I can't remember. I think it might be the blind Bartimaeus one, where Jesus actually doesn't assume, a bit like you've said, doesn't assume, actually says, what is it that you need? And then he does say that he wants to not be blind, but you know, there's lots and lots of layered reasons why people might not have wanted to be blind. Like I said, it was much harder in that society, you know. But it's interesting that Jesus asked that question, isn't it?
Lucy, do you have your hand up?
As a wheelchair user, I can't tell you how great it was to hear, especially Ruth's analysis. I have long thought that people's need to randomly come up to me, I promise you it's true, randomly come up to me in the street and tell me that God wants to heal me or Jesus wants to heal me, and clergy in church randomly deciding to lay hands for healing on me in the middle of a service, comes from a place of fear of their own vulnerability, and that, oh my God, this could happen to them one day, and let's reject it, let's do something about it. So there's, yeah, I thought that it was really great to have that out in the open, Ruth. I wanted to comment about something in the beginning. It was about the interconnectedness of us all. With you were mentioning people with profound and severe disabilities. I'm not clear. Can you give me some examples of how you think the interconnectedness can really be, how it can be a two-way, how there can be a two-way relationship? What do people have to offer? It just feels quite difficult to me.
Yeah, so and I'm sorry if I wasn't clear about that. So people like Reinders are not saying it has to be two-way, but they're saying just because it can't be, fully reciprocal, doesn't mean that means there shouldn't be any relationality. And that would be the temptation, right? To say, oh, well, this person can't reply to me or can't make a gesture when I go into their room, so I'm not going to bother trying to be in relationship with them. So that's what he's saying, that that relationality has to be there even if it can't be reciprocal. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Thank you.
Can I just jump in and say as well that I remember reading, I think it was probably in my graduate diploma that I did before my MA, reading about Peter Singer. And I remember at the time thinking, this is really problematic. Because it's true, he makes being a person about the capacities we have. And lots of us won't have lots of capacities, and some of us will get dementia as just a beginning point, you know, to think about. And I actually want to flag up the brilliant work of John Swinton. I think you did have a book that he co-edited, but he's written some books on dementia. And he has this idea of people living in the memory of God, which I think is so beautiful, because personhood is not just about, like Peter Singer seems to think, having a you remember everything you did, or because actually for all of us memory is a little bit fluid, because you know they've done studies on this, and it's we kind of falsely remember quite a lot of stuff, actually, all of us, even those of us who don't have dementia. But this idea that actually, do you know what? And I do visit in my job that I have, not with Northern Baptist College, but as a pastor in a church, I do visit people with dementia, and this kind of idea that you can just sit with them and, you know, it's okay if they don't remember. What concerns me more is when they're very anxious about not remembering. And then I think it's all about just conveying that, you know, what matters is that you're loved by God. You're in the heart of God. You're in the memories of God, and that's what makes you who you are and the person you are. So I think it's really damaging, the Peter Singer stuff, but obviously some of it was probably good, but you know, nobody's entirely bad, but in their theology. But yeah,
he did some interesting work on the rights of animals, but that's very much, again, very capacities based, that we have to respect some specific animals because they have very specific capacities, which earns them our respect. And so it's a really, it's an interest, if you like, from a kind of creation care perspective, it's a helpful result, but the way that he gets to that result is deeply troubling in terms of what it says about
yeah, I agree.
humans and animals and capacities based assessment. Yeah,
I agree, and I think it is helpful up to a point in terms of recognition of animal rights. But again, like you say, it's for me, it's helpful only if you see it as a spectrum. You know, in terms of that you don't separate animals like they're completely separate and other to us. You know, and so therefore they don't deserve anything. We deserve everything. And I guess that's the same with disability and not, and you know, especially intellectual disability and capacity and not having a disability. Yeah, it's not like there's some kind of line.
yeah.
How does this, this is a bit of a jump, Ellie. How does this relate to the writings in the later Bonhoeffer and the prison writings about the weakness of God? Because you're talking at the beginning about the person describing, you know, the wounds of Christ, etc. Then later you talk much more broadly about God as weak, and I'm just thinking of, you know, kind of, you know, onward, almighty, etc., etc. I mean, that's clearly a rejection of that. But
Yeah,
is there a
and
link? Sorry, you know, you know what I'm trying to say.
yeah, that you're absolutely onto something. There's absolutely a link, and so that sermon that we saw a snippet from, that 1934 sermon, is on, of course, now I've forgotten where this verse appears in the Bible because I can never remember anything to do with Bible chapters and verses, but it's the bit where Paul is saying, my strength is made perfect in weakness, which Ruth was just alluding to a few moments ago. And so there's clearly a trajectory in Bonhoeffer's thought where he yeah, there's a kind of dogleg to do here in his thinking, because he's going from there on to a few years later he's going to be writing discipleship, where he's focusing on the Sermon on the Mount, where it's all about, you know, the meek inheriting the earth, and those who mourn are going to be comforted. So an emphasis on discipleship being about embracing the lowliness of life. And then, of course, as you say, he goes on to write about the suffering God and the weakness. Only the suffering God can help is one of the themes in his letters and papers, and emphasizing the weakness of Christ in Gethsemane, as we were thinking about last week with Tim Judson. So there's definitely a streak in his work which is rejecting the kind of flag waving victorious God, and trying to emphasize the suffering weak God. And you can see why he would want to do that because of his context, right? Who is it that's waving all the flags and talking about victory all the time? It's the Nazi Party and the Nazi regime wanting to co-opt parts of the church to have a strong God supporting their endeavors, right? And so you can see that Bonhoeffer would be uncomfortable going along with a strong victorious God narrative, and is instead trying to find a portrayal of God which makes sense in a time of extreme suffering and lack of power. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I'm looking, I can't see any. Jeff has his hand up.
I was going to say that I think one of the striking things in my own experience was to do with disability, but a disability that was the result of an industrial accident. It's not the kinds of disability that seem to have preoccupied most of what we've been talking about. What was interesting about that family experience, because it wasn't just an individual's experience, it had a vast effects. It was a coal mining accident in which somebody who had been highly active in life as a young man, at the age of 23, having just got married, he was suddenly, well, first of all, confined to bed, but later on to a wheelchair. But he wouldn't, his Christian faith, and he was very much a Christian, led him into being a musical composer in the brass band world. And what I always remember was how the family built and supported him in all those sorts of things. It's as if there's a kind of natural response to, well, certainly to crisis in that case. But surely once one takes the view, as he did, that he was going to be strong, there seemed to me to be a connection between the two. And I was trying to relate that to Bonhoeffer's ideas as you were describing them. And I'm not sure I can do that, but I certainly think that kind of disability is something that we also have to look at. And I just, that's all I can add to it, really. But maybe you can comment.
I mean, based on what you say, it raises a couple of points in my mind. I think first of all, there's the human. You talked about response to crisis. I think there is in the disability community, if we can even use such a phrase, that's quite a contested phrase in itself, but let's just go with it for now. Within the disability community, there's quite often divides between people who have only ever experienced life as a disabled person, so, you know, having a disability that's with them from birth, and then people who become disabled in later life through an accident, often is how it happens. And people's attitudes to life with disability are often quite different depending on when the disability kind of enters their lives. It's very hard to generalize, but thinking about the question that Ruth was raising earlier about the afterlife, in very general terms, people who were disabled later in life often will say that they think they won't be disabled in the resurrected life, and people who have had disability from birth tend to, again, I'm generalizing, which is dangerous, but tend to see disability as very much part of who they are. And so the disability will still be with them in the resurrected life because that's their identity in God. And so that can be a kind of a trend within the disability community. And I think that's partly to do with how we think about ourselves, right? And how we respond to huge changes in life that happen all of a sudden. Yeah, I don't know if Ruth, you wanted to add anything.
I was going to say, in terms of that kind of story, Jeff, I think there's a very useful and helpful phrase in Nancy Eastland's book where she says that disability, and especially acquiring a disability, is often requires grief, but grief is not the same as tragedy. And so I think that's a really helpful way to look at it. So it's normal that someone would have to adapt and come to terms with something if it was completely new and it was completely different from how they were before. But that doesn't mean their life is over, which is often how society has sadly portrayed it. And that hurts and harms everyone. not disabled people, because then we are never prepared for any eventuality. And you have really toxic films like Me Before You and things where it's like, I'm just going to kill myself now because I'm disabled. It's absolutely horrendous, this kind of thinking, and it harms everyone, because we could all have that happen. We could all, and we most likely will, like I've said before, especially if we're lucky enough to live long enough, we will lose capacities. So to have this kind of, it means that people can't prepare themselves, can't imagine, have no imagination in terms of projecting themselves. And it is hard, of course, to project yourself into a completely different life. But they just have no reference point really to be able to adapt sometimes. And sometimes you see it that people get actually worse mental health conditions when they acquire disability, which is because they can't adapt and they can't come to terms with it. Whereas if the society was more positive about actually, you know, yes, this has changed, yes, you haven't got these capacities, blah, 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 but you can have a new life in this way, then maybe people would not suffer so much. I think it's like, this is the social model again, isn't it? It's the society making us suffer in that way.
Thanks, Ruth. Lucy, I wasn't sure if you were indicating that you wanted to.
I was just, I was agreeing, but I do want to comment. Yes, I know.
Yes, please do.
I know several people who, people who have become disabled who, yeah, that film, Me Before You, it's horrendous. The book, it's awful. But they would say that yes, they went through grieving, but now they regard their lives in two halves. That there was them before and now, and they're now is equally valuable, and they are equally as happy in a completely different way. So yeah, I mean, I think this thing about would you want to be healed if you could? Would you want to be cured? It's and you know, in heaven, what would you want? Is very difficult. Yeah, I just wanted to comment about the Amy Kenny book. I love the title, and I love some of all her strap lines about things people have said to her. I find some of the parables of like the thing about Zacchaeus and whether they were disabled and whether Jacob was really disabled. I find them a bit too literal, but that's probably a subject for another day. But yeah.
Thank you very much. I can't see any other hands, so I think it falls to me at this point to thank Ruth and Ellie enormously for.
Alan, sorry, can I just
sorry,
jump
Ruth, please do.
That was a very interesting comment in the chat, actually, which might not quite have been a question, but I'd quite like to respond to it.
Okay,
at the risk of being controversial here. There have been
right, I do apologise. Yes.
That's okay. Do you want to read it first and then I'll respond to it?
I think Bonhoeffer's ethic can speak into the current discussion about assisted dying. I'm apologise. I'm sorry, I missed that. Sorry. I think it is, and I'm glad someone's raised that because it's so current, isn't it? And I think it is quite important to look at it from a disability angle. I'm not the expert that Ellie is in terms of Bonhoeffer, so she might have something to say to Bonhoeffer linking into this. But for me, and I've thought a lot around this, and I've watched, you know, things that Liz Carr as documentaries and stuff she's done. For me, it's not like a black and white kind of either or, but my fear is that I don't think our society, as it currently is disability friendly enough to have an assisted dying bill and allow that to come in and not have all sorts of horrible consequences for disabled people. But if we were a disability, like if we were not ableist in society, it might not be as scary for disabled people. But you can take the idea of abortion to see exactly what I mean. For example, you might not be, and I'm not particularly black and white on abortion, like maybe if I was Catholic I might be, but what is horrendous about abortion is that you have, it's quite an early limit for everyone, except especially like disabled people, especially Down's syndrome people, which actually you can abort a person with Down's until they're coming down the birth canal. So this is the kind of ableist stuff that I fear would come in with assisted dying, and that's why I don't think we should bring it in. But it's for that reason, really, not kind of purist reasons. Thank you very much. I'm very sorry I missed that comment in the chat. Ellie, did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree, Ruth, with all the concerns that you raised. I think there's I'm Swiss, and therefore I'm from a country that has exit, and I know people who have used exit, in one particular case because of a progressive illness that was expressed in physical disability for a very long time. And all the concerns that you raise around how society treats disabled people and the norms that are expected of what it means to be human, particularly around autonomy and the importance that is laid on autonomy and autonomous living, that played in heavily to my friend's decision to end her life with exit. And I think that we're, that's the avenue that Switzerland has chosen, and there's nothing we can do about it now. But I think that for England, it's a stark warning to actually see the reasoning that people are using to choose to die with exit. And I think it's really, yeah, if this gets passed, I have the same fears that you do, I think. From a purely Bonhoefferian perspective, he kind of writes about this in his Ethics. I think it's in the chapter Natural Life, but I would have to go back and check to be sure. Because the Nazi Party are doing, programs of euthanasia, and he is very clear that this is not something that he is prepared to accept. Of course, assisted dying can't be just simply equated to euthanasia, so we have to be really careful around our language here. But I think that if we were to just go with Bonhoeffer as a guide, he would want to be highlighting the responsibilities that we each have as members of society towards our fellow members of society, rather than putting pressure onto decision makers as isolated individuals. And I think that would be where he would encourage us to go in our thinking. Yeah, the kind of corporate responsibility that he talks about a lot in his Ethics, I think would apply to this debate.
Well, Anderson, you raised the point in the chat. Would you like to respond to anything that Ellie or Ruth has said?
I just agree. I just think there are many shades of grey in all of this, and there isn't a one size fits all. There should never be like a checklist, right? Right, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this, right, bye. Which is, I think we're in danger of doing. I think we need to have that. There needs to be a conversation, and it's nuanced for each person. So that was all I was going to say.
Thank you.
Yeah, and we also need, for me, we need to stop thinking that people, because they've made a decision themselves, therefore that's okay, that makes it okay. But that all of our decisions are not just based on some kind of neutral thinking. They're based on what society is also kind of embedded in us, and the kind of negativity around disability that we then have on ourselves, and we think we're a burden, and so it is really murky for me. So thanks for that, bringing that up, Anderson.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. And again, enormous thanks to Ruth and to Ellie for your presentations. Thank you very much indeed. It's a very complicated and difficult area which you discuss with great clarity, and I'm sure everyone is very, very appreciative. Thank you very much indeed. Before you all disappear, I mentioned at the beginning that there was something, as everybody here will probably know, the 9th of April is the 80th anniversary of Bonhoeffer's murder at the hands of the Nazis, and Project Bonhoeffer and the Council of Lutheran Churches and the Leeds Chaplaincy is planning to hold a one-day lecture and conference to mark this. And we're very pleased that just recently Bishop Martin Lind, who's a very distinguished Lutheran theologian and Bonhoeffer scholar, has agreed to come over and give a lecture in Leeds on that day, the 9th of April next year. And we're hoping with Zoom to link him to some quite distinguished discussants as well. And one of the things that Bishop Linda's written about in the past is how Christianity responds to Christian nationalism. And those of you who've been aware of some of the appalling uses of Bonhoeffer recently in the US, I think that may well prove to be one theme that we could ask him to address. But that's just a note for way out. But April the 9th, we will be holding this now in Leeds. Well, again, thanks very much to our speakers. Thank you very much for coming. And as you have signed up for one of these already, you'll get a notification when we next arrange any seminars or other events. But thank you all very much for coming, and goodbye.